welcome to episode 16 of Last Turn. I'm Bart, and today I'm joined by Evan. Evan, how are you enjoying your post-nerf metagame?
I mean, I'm honestly pretty happy with it. It was a little rough at the beginning when everything was settling in, but I've been having a lot of fun with Rogue. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, me too. I think the deck is very strong. It does a lot of really powerful things, and it's nice that it can exist now. Some of its weaknesses have been shored up because there isn't a Pirate Warrior around anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was seeing Pirate Warrior. I mean, maybe not the past 2 days, but for a good at least 5 days after the nerf, people were still trying to play it. The Keleseth version came out. Um, but it's just so much weaker that Rogue wasn't so punished by it anymore. Um, and then this sort of aggro list is really cool because there's so many ways to build it. Some of them are using two princes, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I was originally playing a list that had Cobalt Scalebane in it, which is a really fun card. Really good against Priest because it doesn't get potioned. And it usually gives one of your 1 power guys 3 power, making it a 4 power guy.
Yeah, I definitely have not played around with that card in that list, but it seems like a really good home for it because you just have so many dudes.
Yeah, the Fireflies and Swashbuckler patches just pretty much provides you a constant board. And then turn 5, you play that guy, and you're in a really threatening spot.
Yeah, Cobalt Scalebane is one of my favorite cards that's just like on the cusp of playability. I feel like it doesn't have a perfect home yet, but if it did, it'd just be like a good card.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, one advantage of it over Bittertide is that you don't take the damage.
Oh yeah.
But it's not as scary.
Yeah.
And it's not as hard to deal with.
Yeah, but
overall.
Ultimately, I mean, I think it's matchup dependent. But
Mm-hmm.
it's a good card, and people are refining that list. It's one I don't think we talked too much about last week, but has definitely gotten a lot of positive attention and seen a lot of success.
Yep, it's got a really good win rate on VS,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Like the highest.
Yeah, that's what they report.
Yeah, that's crazy. Especially because there's also a version that's Elementals, which I think is also really good.
Yeah, that's something that's so cool about it. The elemental version is good. I mean, Blaze Caller is really good. It just gives you access to yet another tempo swing type minion, and that's just so good for the deck.
Yeah, you're basically just trying to stack those on top of each other, especially with the elemental version, because you play the Phoenix, which is the same thing again,
right,
as SI agent, and smaller Blaze Caller. Blaze Caller is also great with shadow casting.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And Shadow Step.
Yes.
Yeah,
There's a lot of cute things you can do with those cards in the deck, which makes it pretty fun.
Yeah, it's I read a piece of wisdom about magic brewing a while ago, and it's when you have access. The wisdom in the context of magic was when you have access to 8 copies of one effect, you should start thinking about what kind of decks you want to put that effect in. And it's the same story here with these tempo swinging minions. You have four SI agents, and you have like between Blaze Caller and Vilespine, like basically 4 Vilespines. So it's interesting that jamming them all into one shell actually works out. So today we wanted to talk about a universal concept in Hearthstone and probably in like video games in general. And probably not even just video games, probably all games. And this is the concept of fair versus unfair.
This might even fall into life.
Yeah, I think I mean, certainly life. In the context, in the what we're talking about is probably a lot more prevalent in games and more important in games than it is in life, or maybe not. Maybe you just want to be unfair all the time everywhere.
I mean, I was going to say that life is mostly the unfair side.
It's true. Well, yeah, but maybe in a different sense. I think if you're... Anyway, we should introduce it.
Anyway, Hearthstone.
Yeah, Hearthstone, right. We're not trying to give you life advice here. We can't do that. We just know memes.
So many cards.
So when you have an interaction or a set of cards or a strategy that is fair, what you're doing is you're staying within the bounds of the rules of the game. You're
Mm.
doing something that the game expects you to do. So if you had a deck that was made mostly of basic cards, say you're playing a mage, you might on turn 2 play like a 2/3. On turn 3 you might play a 3/3, or like Frostbolt something, just do 3 damage to something for 2 mana. And then on turn 4 you might play Chillwind Yeti. And if you were playing, another class on turn 3 you might play a 3/2 weapon, since 3/2 weapons cost 3 mana.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're like a Cabal type class, on turn 6 you might play a hard removal spell, maybe like Meteor or Siphon Soul or Entomb. These are the things that you're expecting to do, and when you're expecting to do them. You're not expecting to play your hard removal spell on turn 2. You're not expecting to play your 4/5 on turn 1, and you're not expecting to get a 3/2 weapon on turn 2. That'd be insane. So
What about a 3/4 in turn 2?
that's unfair. So
Okay.
so
I'm getting it.
when you break these bounds, and you start to go beyond what you're expected to do when you're expected to do it, you cross into the realm of unfair. And so we've seen a lot of unfair cards in Hearthstone, and a lot of the strategies that leverage unfair cards or unfair strategies tend to do very well. So, like you mentioned, a 3/4 on turn 2, we all remember the terrifying meta-defining force that was Totem Golem.
Good times.
Yeah, this card was basically in a tier 1. This card was part of a tier 1 strategy pretty much since it came out. The card was just unbelievable.
Yeah, very few lists ever didn't run 2 copies.
Yeah.
And you could even say it like went beyond that. Like part of the reason Tuskar Totemic, a completely different card, was so good is because of Totem Golem.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean,
he
they had
just
to
like he was so good. He made other cards good without even being like involved.
Yeah, I mean they had to nerf Tuskar Totemic so that it couldn't grab Totem Golem, and then the card went from being played all the time to seeing no play or very little play.
They also took Mana Tide and Flame Tongue off, but
Yeah.
Totem Golem was definitely the most degenerate thing to do, because
yeah.
at that point, to see, let's give it the test. You get 6 power and
6 toughness.
6 toughness for 3 mana.
Does
that sound right? That doesn't sound right to me.
That's not correct at all. It's way above rate. And so that's also why 4 mana 7/7 is such a meme, is because you expect a Chillwind Yeti for 4 mana, but here Shaman is getting a 7/7 on turn 4.
Pretty big.
So, of course, the caveat there is that, well, if it's so broken, why doesn't he play in every Shaman deck? It's not just that. I mean, it's an unfair thing, but just because it's unfair doesn't mean it's going to be broken all the time. You have to have a deck that really wants to be overloading itself twice on turn 4. And those lists definitely exist. Go check out Wild Aggressive Shaman. The deck is real. It's pretty strong. Anyway, so there's this idea of unfair interactions and unfair cards that let you get around the limitations in Hearthstone. And so throughout Hearthstone's history, a lot of the best decks have been decks that are doing something unfair. They're getting around the limitations that the game tries to put on them through synergistic interactions, or through, combinations of cards, or even just individual cards.
Like 4 mana 7/7s.
Like 4 mana 7/7, or 2 mana 2/3, 3/2s, 3/4s. Wow. Third time's the charm on your 2-drop.
But also Tunnel Trog, 1 mana 2/3s.
Yeah.
And then some.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 1 mana 2/3 is an insane stat line. Or Small Time Buccaneer, the 1 mana 3/2 was pretty good.
That was pretty gross. Yeah. Along with Spirit Claws, we were talking about how weapons might be have 3 power when they cost 3 mana. And Spirit Claws would tend to have 3 power at 1 mana with 3 durability.
Yeah, I mean, in some games, this was just a better Fiery War Axe because it could kill 3 things. And, Fiery War Axe already had such a high win rate. Imagine killing 3 things with it. It's just very easy to win those games. So, we see unfair interactions all the time throughout Hearthstone's history. This goes back pretty far. So, I think you could probably bring this back all the way to the beginning of Hearthstone with stuff like Starving Buzzard and Unleash the Hounds. But, if you want to start a little bit later, we could look at late 2015 with Patron Warrior.
Patron.
So, Patron was fun. That was an awesome deck. It was completely degenerate and totally meta-warping. And why is this? It's a control deck. It's a warrior control deck. So, warrior control just has infinite answers for everything. But it was a warrior control deck that could kill you from an empty board with over 50 damage.
Yeah, it could just explode your head. It could also make just a massive board that you can't kill. Like any attempt to kill it would just make more of it.
Yep. Yeah, it could generate this army in a can that you couldn't possibly deal with between Grim Patrons, Warsong Commanders, and like Inner Rages and Whirlwind effects. It was just a very, very powerful deck. And ultimately, its ability to generate all of that out of nowhere goes well beyond the mana restrictions that are already in the game, and it goes well beyond the turn restrictions in some cases. I mean, you don't have to start this process on turn 10 necessarily. You could start it earlier than that. So, that led that deck to being adjusted because of how unfair it was. Its unfairness was metagame warping.
It was getting too much stuff too fast.
Yep.
To put it lightly.
Definitely. And so later in 2016 through early 2017, we have shaman decks. And so we talked about this, but they had the most broken openers in the game. Tunnel Trog into Totem Golem was incredibly hard to beat. And if you stack like Spirit Claws into Wrath of Air Totem on that, or just like Tunnel Trog into Hero Power into like Feral Spirits, you have so much tempo on the first 3 turns of the game before like any answers in any deck are live.
Yeah, there's really very little anyone can do about that kind of board.
Yeah, one of the only answers in the game was like Hellfire, or was Excavated Evil legal? I think it was for part of that.
Yeah, but
it definitely was.
Totem Golem lives either way.
Totem Golem does, yeah, that's for sure.
So like it really was just like a huge amount of stats, really fast. Also some pretty damn good removal in Lightning Bolt. And Lava Burst could also be used to clear problem minions like taunts, but ultimately that could also just be pointed at your face.
Right.
This is also when Rockbiter weapon cost 1. Wow,
that's true.
I kind of forgot about that, but that was really, really unfair, particularly with Doomhammer.
Yeah, definitely. Spending 7 mana and 3 cards to burst somebody for like over 15 it's just above what you're expecting to do.
Yeah, I think it's 18.
Yeah, right. Well, it's like the 2 plus 6, right? So, yeah, that would be 16.
No, 16. Okay,
but
it's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah, right. So you're bursting your opponent for a ton of damage, and you probably already chipped in with, your good openers and some of your burn spells, or you're just sitting on them because the kind of decks that went into were like aggressive decks, and Shaman could build an aggressive deck really well because it had such insane openers, plus all this really good burn to reach once they like managed to stabilize and put a taunt down. So, these decks were able to take the part of the game where they were really unfair, which is like the first 3 turns, and another part of the game where they were unfair, which is like later, turn 7-ish, and just fill out the middle with like efficient plays and burn spells so that it could sort of fill the gaps between its unfair parts with stuff that would like advance its game plan, advance the game plan of the unfair stuff.
Keep their opponent from developing anything and from coming back in any way before finishing them off.
Right.
There's also Thing from Below, another becomes a really insane deal. Like at first, it's fair, maybe even below what you expect as a 6-mana 5/5 taunt. But once you play enough totems, and Totem Golem once again is the hero. You can be paying a really unfairly low amount of mana for that 5/5 taunt.
Yeah, totally. I mean, once you've played 2 totems, a 4 mana 5/5 taunt's already a pretty good deal, and anything below that is just great. And it's not uncommon for it to go to 0. So, the introduction of stuff like Jades gave the deck Jade Lightning, it gave the deck like Aya.
And just the Claws.
Yeah, and Jade Claws, it's still just one of the best Shaman cards. The card's insane. And it contributes, even though Shaman's early game isn't as oppressive now as it used to be, it's still got some of the best early game, ever, because of cards like Jade Claws and Flame Tongue Totem and actually even Firefly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really, in this case, it's about figuring out what your deck is doing that's unfair, when it's being unfair in the game, and how it's being unfair, and then how to sort of wrap that into a deck that advances that strategy. And this was just a really streamlined way to do it.
Yeah, you gotta just be consistently being unfair. And this deck just had like a whole bunch of low cost big minions and low cost strong damage spells, and that wound up being really consistent 30 cards.
Totally. Yeah, I still run that in like I said, I it's a good wild deck, and I still run it when I have a shaman quest.
Sounds fair. Just kidding.
It's really not.
It's
So
really not.
in early Ungoro, speaking of unfair, I think we saw maybe eclipsed only by Patron Warrior, but it's hard to know. Probably not, though. We saw one of the least fair Hearthstone decks ever, which is Crystal Core Rogue.
Oh yeah, I played a lot of that deck.
So I actually do think that this was a less fair deck than Patron Warrior. No, so note that fair doesn't necessarily, fair doesn't mean bad. So unfair doesn't necessarily mean good. Unfair is often quite good, but they're not one to one. So Patron Warrior was a stronger deck with a higher win rate than Crystal Rogue, which like by some metrics actually had a very bad win rate. But it was still incredibly prevalent despite its lackluster win rate. And it was meta defining despite its lackluster win rate. And so the deck must be doing something ridiculous in order for that to be true. And it is. It was doing one of the most unfair things in Hearthstone, which is to start pumping out 1 mana 5/5 charges at some point around turn 6.
Yeah, like a lot of them. Like
Yeah,
a
out of
ridiculous
nowhere.
amount. Like how there's so many. Make it
Yeah, I mean,
stop.
it could easily just do 20 damage from hand out of nowhere. So, this deck until it was doing that was basically doing nothing. It was basically playing solitaire and not in any way protecting itself, or only mildly protecting itself.
Yeah, its
With
plays
maybe like Doomsayer or Tarkreeper.
were really weak. Often not even Doomsayer. And like Tar Creeper without anything else is very frequently just not gonna do much.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to kill. So this was a deck that, definitely had a glaring gap in its strategy in the first few turns, so that's when you wanted to sort of win. But after that, it became nigh unbeatable. So if you gave them like 2 or 3 turns after they proc their Crystal Core, you probably weren't going to win. And so what this meant for the metagame is that slow value-based strategies just didn't work. You
Hmm.
just couldn't play them. Because if you were playing, say, Priest Control, and like, okay, you run into Pirate Warrior, you like stabilize early game, beat them. You run into like Paladin, you stabilize early game, and you beat some of their mid game threats, and then you beat them. You run into Crystal Rogue, you do nothing for 5 turns, and then they pop their Crystal Core, and then you just can't beat
Yeah, there's no. I mean, I guess there is a number of Dragonfire potions, but it's hard to imagine that someone could get enough to stop all the 5/5s. I mean, there's things
them.
like Igneous Elemental, which is a 5/5 that when it dies, it gives you 2/5/5s. Like,
Right. It's just, even if they're not using charge minions, they're just putting out an onslaught of threats that you have to deal with. 5/5 is like no joke. So,
yeah. And some lists will play Byleth Tidehunter to make a taunt. Firefly certainly gives you another minion, and then you're using Vanish and bounce minions and bounce spells to return those cards to your hand and make even more minions. So you just never run out.
yeah.
You just inevitably win because of how many 5/5s you have.
Yeah, so basically there comes a point in the game where this deck cheats on both cards and mana at the same time, and it also cheats on turns because it has so many charge minions. So it just does nothing, and then it cheats on everything you can possibly cheat on. You're playing 1 mana 5/5s. They have charge, and they like generate more 5/5s. It's just really, really hard to deal with something that's that unfair, and no value-based or control deck could possibly do that, and so those decks didn't exist. And I
Hmm.
mean, that's a testament to how unfair this deck was, that it had, by some accounts, a win rate below 50%, but it still made those decks just unplayable in that metagame.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that is possibly one of the least fair things we've ever seen in Hearthstone. And
I'm inclined to agree.
yeah, definitely. And so it's definitely worth mentioning in a discussion of sort of fairness and unfairness. Um, so later, after that was nerfed, the Angora metagame actually became wonderful. By many accounts, it is one of the most diverse and amazing metagames we've ever seen in Hearthstone.
Good times.
Um, oh yeah, I super liked it. But it also had its fair share of unfairness going
Hmm.
on. So, pretty much every deck was able to do something that was unfair, with the exception of, like, I guess some of the control decks, like Burn Mage, was pretty fair. But it had a bunch of aggressive decks that were all cheating on tempo in the early game. So specifically, I mean Pirate Warrior, which of course predates Ungoro,
Hmm.
the aggressive Murloc Paladin decks, and the aggressive Druid token build. So each one of these decks is trying to, in the first 3 turns, generate some amount of tempo that's just impossible to tango with and ride whatever early game advantage and early game board they get to the end of the game.
Hmm.
Paladin does this with Rockpool Hunter and Tidecaller into War Leader, and Warrior does this with like N'Zoth's First Mate into like Coin Cultist, or pretty much anything. N'Zoth's First Mate just has such a high win rate on its own. It's basically muster for battle for 1 mana. That's not fair.
It's pretty
Um,
gross.
oh yeah.
Or 2 mana Fire War Axe is also pretty strong.
Yep, 2 mana Fire War Axe was also really good and has always been really good. But especially in a tempo-based shell, it just does exactly what you want. And then this aggressive Druid deck would just cheat on mana, because that's what Druid always does. And, that's more on that later. But the token Druid deck would innervate out a bunch of, like, individually fair minions, I guess with the exception of anything that involves getting patches from your deck. But it would get out a bunch of fair minions and then buff them all. So you end up spending 4 or 5 mana, and you just pick up a board filled with 2/3s and like a 2/2 charge.
Yeah, so ultimately the final result is extremely unfair. Like you
Yes.
could be getting like 6+ power and more health on the first turn, like all the time. Like and it's so hard to beat that. And then
Yeah,
and
very
then your
very
deck
good
is
scale.
full of more pump spells that just make that more and more of a problem for your opponent.
Yeah, and then it has cards like Living Mana, which are it's like, sometimes it's 5 mana for like 14/14 worth of stats.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
that if they do manage to deal with what you first put out, you sort of have a one card. Well, here we go again. Like now you got to deal with this too.
yeah, and the downside of that, so that's unfair, and of course it has a downside. The drawback being that you just like lose all your mana crystals, but at least temporarily. But this deck was just built to deal with that because it had like up to 13 1-drops.
Hmm.
So it just doesn't, or well, 13 cards that cost 1 or less mana, I guess. It
Yeah.
just it doesn't matter. Plus, it had Innervate, so like it doesn't even care that it doesn't have mana crystals because it actually just has mana crystals. Um,
Yeah, like particularly like Mark of the Lotus,
yeah.
or if you have like enough mana, you'll keep some mana. It's just it was perfect in that deck.
Oh yeah, and into something like Savage Roar, it often just wins the game. So this deck was able to take an individually unfair card and combine it with unfair early game interactions, really tied together a lot by Innervate. Although we are seeing some successful aggressive Druid decks right now, I don't know how much staying power they have, although they are doing quite good. Um,
That's cool.
yeah, yeah, it's pretty neat. I definitely don't want to play that kind of deck ever again.
I
Um, played it way too much.
didn't know that. I mean, I'd seen like one aggro druid, but they did not put up much of a fight.
Yeah, I haven't. I've only seen it a couple times on the ladder, but VS is saying that it's doing pretty well, and their like live Reaper report has a bunch of successful stuff there.
I mean,
Um,
if it's got Galaka Crawler, it's destined to do at least okay.
yeah, this is a great crawler metagame right now. I agree. So anyway, these types of fast, aggressive decks would cheat in the first few turns of the game and just try to out cheat the opponent because often it was like a mirror of these kinds of decks. And then once it did all its unfair things, it would do relatively fair things for the rest of the game
Hmm.
and try to just beat you with fair stuff. But that's fine because they already did their unfair stuff to just generate an advantage, and then they ride it to the end of the game. Um, there are also other types of decks in Ungoro, like Secret Mage. This is a deck that cheats on mana and on tempo at the same time.
Yeah, this is a good deck.
Yeah, it's always been a good deck. It's always gotten a little bit of a bad rap in like the tournament scene. I think not a lot of lineups have it,
Hmm.
and a lot of pros think it's like not a super strong deck. It never got that much attention, probably because it's pretty easy to play around the secrets. But sometimes it's not.
Yeah, it really does depend on the metagame, but if there's a
Yeah.
lot of, you know, 5 mana spells and 6 mana spells going around, just having a bunch of counter spells can be great.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I think that deck showed us how good a card Counterspell was. I mean,
Hmm.
after Secret Mage started seeing play, people started putting Counterspell in like Burn Mage.
Yeah, I definitely did that.
Yeah, it's a really good card, and I think it surprised everybody. It's been around for so long, but just didn't see much play. Um, so after Ungoro, we of course have Knights of the Frozen Throne, and we've talked at length about this.
Hmm.
Uh, we all remember Druidstone. We all remember 40% of the decks being Jade Druid. We all remember this.
Yeah,
So
it was they're larger men after larger men.
lots of large men there. And so it's obviously unfair. The Jade Druid deck just cheated on mana at every stage of the game, and was, in many cases, not even just like rare, Reddit-worthy screenshots or whatever. Just in a lot of games, it was getting a 10 mana spell that itself is arguably worth 17 mana out on turn 4 or 5. That's not fair.
Yeah, that's not fair.
No. And with cards like Innervate, even after it got a 10 mana spell out, whenever it happened to do that, it could just like continue to play spells. So the
Hmm.
deck just cheated on mana at every stage of the game, and that's really strong. Very few decks and very few classes can get around the mana restrictions. That's one of the things that's like really hard. Often your way of getting around mana restrictions is by getting more tempo or more value than you expect at a mana cost.
Hmm.
But this deck was able to, get its like cheatiest cards, the ones that gave the best deal for their mana cost, but also get around mana, just straight up get around mana. So it made
Yeah,
its fair cards just way better.
yeah. The how consistently it could like permanently upgrade its mana crystals, which is like really the unique thing about Druid here.
Yeah.
Um, but then also how impactful its cards are. Like once it's accelerated enough, now you're slamming like Malfurion the Pestilent, or maybe Primordial Drake or Jade Behemoth. Any of these cards, um, Spreading Plague. Um, you can play them sooner, and they're really high impact, and then your opponent's just going to be like struggling against that, and then from there on, eventually your Jade cards become ridiculous deals. Like when Jade
Yes.
Spirit's making you a 7/7, that's not fair.
Yeah, right. That's something completely unfair. You're totally cheating on mana in that case. You're getting better rate than 4 mana 7/7 and no overload. That's absurd. Or I mean, Jade Idol, of course, being the most egregious rate possible in the deck,
Yeah,
because it's
for sure.
often like a 1 mana 12/12.
That's a pretty good deal. I would play that card. Yeah, I did
Oh yeah.
a lot.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
And,
more than I would like.
and Blizzard like made a card specifically to get rid of it for the most part.
Yeah, yeah. They printed Skulking Geist, which is like the most targeted hate. I guess we've seen like Galactic Crawler and stuff, but it was some interesting targeted hate, because it's very rare that you target like a spell, right? But
Yeah.
it did do that. Um, so yeah, this was a deck that did a lot of unfair things, and just did one of the most unfair things, which is cheat on mana. I mean, even think about like Magic.
Hmm.
Look at the Power 9. 6 of the cards in the Power 9 are just mana cards. They're cards that let you cheat on mana.
One of them just dies immediately, and it's arguably the best one.
Yeah, right. The best one, the most valuable card in Magic the Gathering, the $20,000 like children's card game card, is just something that gives you 3 mana for free.
It's just a super innervate. But like
Yeah,
that does that not sound extraordinary? Especially now that we
yeah,
don't even have regular innervate anymore.
right. In Hearthstone, in this silly little computer game, the 2 mana innervate was way too much. But just imagine in a game like Magic having a 3 mana innervate. That's absurd, and it turns out it's just like the best card ever.
It
Um,
is nonsense.
Yeah. So I think that really tells you something about how, that kind of deck is broken, and also a really, really good way to be unfair. Uh,
Hmm.
Cheating on mana is just always one of the most broken things ever. And it's one of the things that, like, I think the Hearthstone devs are learning now that they have to be very careful about. I think that, like, printing Ultimate Infestation into the 2 mana innervate was a really big lesson for them, I imagine.
Hmm.
That, like, you can, it's good to give decks payoffs. If you have a ramp class, giving them a ramp payoff is like, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, it's going to feel bad when they get a really good draw and you lose to it, but that's true of every strategy in the game.
Hmm.
um but when you let them cheat and get there like well before they're supposed to, like way before, or just get there way too consistently, or even once they play it, allow them to continue doing stuff, you've gone a little bit too far.
Yeah, it really was, like Nourish no longer became a question. And like whether or not you just need to get to higher mana, there was no longer any mystery about that. The answer is always yes, because then you get to play
Yeah.
this one card that gives you everything back. So it doesn't matter how many cards you spent to get there, because you just get a full hand again.
Hmm.
And so there was you never needed to choose between the two effects of Nourish, for example. Um, and so that sort of removes a decision-making element from the game, which is not good for gameplay and is not good for the game. Um, and having like an ultimate strategy is also not ideal. Um, but with it was, I guess, really truly too unfair with an innervate that made 2 mana.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of happy to see that that had the impact that it did.
Hmm.
It seems like Jade Druid is still strong, but definitely his strength got toned down a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely not the monster it was before, but
Certainly.
I'm quite certain it's still a good deck.
Yeah.
It's just it's got a decent amount of uh swing slots. There's a better word for it.
Flex
Flex
slots.
slots. Thank you, swing slots. Like slots you dance with. I don't know. Um, that so picking those accurately means a lot more now that you're playing more fairly. Um,
Yes.
and choosing those accurately for the metagame. Once again, I'd probably put Galaka Crawlers in my Jade Druid deck. If I were to play Jade Druid right now, though I'm enjoying not playing Jade
Yep,
Druid
me
right
too.
now.
Yeah.
Um, but that is going to be a significant part of succeeding with Jade Druid deck right now. The Jade Druid deck, I think, currently.
Yeah, I agree because you want your flex slots to to be a little bit unfair, but also to be somewhat targeted hate. Glocker Crawler is a good example. Mind Control Tech is another.
Hmm.
Things like Doomsayer is also a really good example.
Yeah, when there's enough aggressive decks, Doomsayer is like excellent, and it
Yeah,
also kind of combos with Spreading Plague.
yeah, definitely does.
I've definitely done that
Um,
to people.
yep, which is a card that's still totally in the deck, still like just as good as it was before. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's sort of a brief history of unfairness in Hearthstone. Uh, like we said in the beginning, it could go back. There's other examples, things we didn't mention, like Secret Paladin, which had just Doctor Six into Doctor Seven. And why do we call them? Why do we call it Doctor Seven? Well, of course, because Doctor Boom, and we call him Doctor Six because, like Doctor Boom, it's an insane amount of mana worth of effects and cards worth of effects for its mana cost. So much so that it's just this massive tempo swing. And once it's played, the game changed suddenly. Like if you were ahead, you are probably not ahead anymore, even if they had an empty board.
Yeah, like you either are going to be leaving a 6/6 there, or if you try to kill it, things are just going to get so poor for you, and everything is going to get enormous.
Yep.
And then you have even more to deal. So you need a preposterous amount of removal. And if you don't, you're just going to get smashed by, like, you're just going to lose to the 6/6. You
Yep.
have to deal with it. And you get punished really hard when you first try to kill it.
Yeah. It's so there's been unfairness, throughout the history of Hearthstone. It's a really important part of the game. And I think that we're actually seeing some of that. We're seeing some of that now. So in the Tempo Road deck that we talked about in the beginning, that is doing something unfair. It's doing it a little bit of a different way. It's something that's a little bit more like the Reno decks. You leverage deck building restrictions to allow you to do something ridiculously unfair. Like kind of
Yeah.
like the quests.
Yeah, playing Prince Keliseth and returning him to your hand and playing him again does feel like you completed an amazing quest.
Yeah, and your quest was you opened up your deck builder and you didn't put any 2 drops into your deck. But like, when you say it like that, it sounds like easy and lackluster. But what are you losing? You're losing Razor Petal Lasher. Undercity Huckster is totally a legal card right now. Yeah, so you're losing that one.
Mm-hmm. Eviscerate.
You're Eviscerate. Yeah, Sap. Like these are cards that are like Eviscerate, especially. These are cards that you just can't play that are insane. They're so good. in rogue decks, and they've been in like pretty much every rogue deck ever. But you can't put them in your deck. But you're rewarded because sometimes you'll be able to on turn 1 or turn 2 just buff all the minions in your deck, and then as the game goes on, the incremental value you get every turn from playing a buffed minion is just going to take you to victory.
Yep, it's helped by the fact that you have a good deal of charge. Like there's South Sea Deckhand, and then Patches, of course. Patches is especially good.
Hmm.
You sort of can, even before you draw a card, or even before you play one of the minions that you drew that got pumped, um, get a minion that was pumped by Keleseth out of your deck and attacking, like, immediately. So that makes Keleseth a lot more relevant. It's not even, you don't even necessarily have to wait that long. Like, if you have an extra mana, you can play a Swashbuckler, and immediately, the same turn you played Keleseth, be attacking with something that he pumped.
Yeah, and that's obviously very strong, and especially with stuff like South Sea Captain, it gets even better.
Because, yeah. So the deck also sort of has like a pirate sub theme, which is really cool. And then if you Kelesith and then play South Sea Captain, he comes out as a 3/3, which is insane. You can kill like a 2/3, immediately, and you're not even spending a card on it. And but
Yeah, that's really good.
a lot of decks, probably a lot of other decks could consider using Kelesith. But he's particularly good in this deck because of how quickly you can get patches. You have the 4 really good 1-drop pirates, along with South
Yeah,
Sea
that you can
Captain.
run. Right. So, and I mean, you if you wanted to, not that you do, but if you wanted to, you could even go up to 6 1-drop pirates.
Yeah,
Um, but the option to run the deckhand is really good because of the hero power. So,
exactly.
Rogue has always been sort of the next runner-up for Pirate Shell. It's just never ever been particularly close whether Rogue or Warrior was the best way to do it. But now it's different. Things have changed a little bit.
Yep, Warrior's best weapon got really hurt and cost more mana. Um, and like if you wanted to do Warlock Keleseth or Druid Keleseth or something, if you do play any pirates, there is probably just going to be the 2 Bloodsail Corsairs at most. So you're not going to be able to get this quick patches nearly as often.
Yeah, and the patches will be a lot less impactful. Like it'll be just a normal patches like it is in every other deck, which is still good.
Oh, of course. I
Obviously.
mean,
Yeah, I mean,
he's in charge.
he's in charge. Yeah, I mean, patches is another. Patches is a great example of something that's kind of unfair because it lets you cheat on tempo on turn 1, and like that's one of the best places to cheat. Is turn 1 before your opponent. Like, think about the games where your opponent just innervated out Vicious Fledgling, and you're like playing Paladin,
Mm,
and Righteous Protector is not a card yet.
yeah, it's
Like,
like not. You don't even call those games.
yeah, it's just not like, oh my god, you feel like you have no chance. Turn 1's a really good time to cheat, and patches is good for that. And the road deck, of course, can do that, as can any deck with pirates and patches in it. But it can also turn its patches into something a little better later, which is really good.
Hmm.
So that I think that's a really good example of an unfair deck that we're seeing now. But
Yeah.
more generally, this is like a new metagame. Post after really important decks get nerfed, after new sets come out, after cards rotate, the metagame changes a lot invariably because important strategies are gone, or new strategies emerge, or new hate cards emerge for important strategies.
Hmm.
So it's always a time where the metagame is shaken up. People try a lot of new stuff. The decks that tend to do really well in these types of environments are aggressive decks. So that's something we see in Magic. I think this upcoming weekend is like Star City Games Open for Ixalan,
Hmm.
or maybe it's the weekend after that. We're probably just going to see ridiculous aggressive decks because we always see that in the week 1 Star City Games opens
Hmm.
um, in Magic. In Hearthstone, we always see aggressive decks on the ladder in the very beginning of a new patch. I think that Frozen Throne is actually a little bit different because of Jade Druid.
Yeah, that changed things because like cards like Spreading Plague when it cost 5 were especially
Yeah,
good against certain aggressive decks.
right. But in the beginning of like Mean Streets, we saw Pirate Warrior, and at the end of Mean Streets, uh, and we also saw aggressive Shaman decks. In the beginning of Ungoro, on top of Quest Rogue, we saw Pirate Warrior. People, even before Quest Rogue was really getting super popular, people were just playing Pirate Warrior and doing really well.
Mhm.
It's because in the beginning, people are playing unrefined strategies, slow strategies, strategies that are ultimately not viable, and the aggressive decks punish them because they can beat them before they get off the ground, or they sort of quote unquote go off, but they're not actually doing anything strong. Um,
Yeah.
right right now, I think we're seeing something like that.
Hmm.
But on top of aggressive decks that tend to do well are not just the aggressive ones. You don't want to just like jam patches into Priest and curve out with patches in your deck.
Well, maybe you
You want
do.
to be. I mean, it would be fun.
I have seen
Um,
some aggro dragon priests that were playing like the 2 mana 2/2 that gives +1/+1,
that's pretty
and
cool.
and patches and pirates.
No, that's cute. That's a deck I should revisit.
It was like, I mean, I was watching someone play against it and it smashed them. It just played so much health and power and minions quickly. And that
Well,
was
so
it.
it was doing something. It was doing something unfair.
Exactly.
So
And it was using Divine Spirit Inner Fire as well.
that's
Just
another thing
another
that's
unfair
unfair.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, so more than just playing aggressive decks, you want to play unfair aggressive decks. And I think that Rogue is one of the best examples, between all its tempo swings, between Kelesith, and it's just like its ways that it can simultaneously develop a board and deal with your like pretty much anything that you put out, but also pump its own board with like Bone Marrow and Cold Blood and like duplicate its Bone Marrow effects with Shadow Steps. And just have a weapon, have like one of the most flexible and sort of valuable hero powers in the game.
Hmm.
Uh, its ability to sort of put all that together just makes it a strong aggressive force. An aggressive deck with no 2 drops, well, 1 2 drop. Um, and it's just doing something unfair the whole time. And that makes it really good. And it's like a very good early patch metagame.
Hmm.
I think that once people catch on and we start seeing a good shell for Galaka crawlers come up, it's probably going to do a little bit worse.
Yeah.
But right now it's very dominant.
Yeah, it's, Hunter can crawl, Druid can do it as well. Uh, but really, almost any deck could potentially do it.
Yeah,
Warlock can play Galactic Crawlers as well, and um, it's hard for a control deck to really do anything about what the rogue deck is doing
yeah,
because like their plays don't really get much worse later on. That's the crazy thing about the deck is that eventually, like you were saying, you start copying your bone mares and other degenerate cards. So you just sort of get ridiculous later on, whereas other aggro decks run out of steam. So
right.
that's one way it makes it really difficult for control decks. And then the aggro decks, those are the decks that you just wipe their board easily. Like they're the ones that are investing their hand into 2 health minions that you just like backstab SI7 agent, patches
Yeah,
attack, and you just like wipe their whole board and make your own board simultaneously, like you were saying.
right.
And so that strategy is really good against aggro. So it's a really resilient deck. Um, so it'll be a matter of finding the right ways to hate on it
Yeah.
for like that'll I guess the Razakis Priest list they're gonna need to adjust that for this rogue deck and like you said probably the most dominant aggro deck is gonna be whatever's using Galacta Crawler most effectively.
Yeah, I actually saw some adapted Razakis priest lists. So in one of the most recent Hearthstone Open tournaments, people were running like singleton priests with dual Galaka crawlers, which is like hilarious. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. The deck draws cards so well, so actually having one double copy in the deck is not so bad.
It's just funny
You know,
that it's friggin' crab.
I know it's so silly. It's so silly that it's Glocker Crawler. It's a card that we initially questioned, upon Ungoro release whether or not it would actually be good enough. It turns out that it's actually great.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty silly. I mean, other Razakis priest lists have sort of just run one crab, but it's running like Turtle Shell Razors, and Gluttonous Oozes, and more cards to interact with the early game, and like Tar Creeper. So it
Hmm.
just goes a little bit, turns off the gas on some of its draw spells and replaces them with cards that interact with the board early, which is kind of like the same thing. I mean, it's obviously worse in control mirrors. Like if you're playing that deck into just a greedy Razaka's Priest deck that's running like Gnomish Inventor or whatever, then you are probably going to lose.
Yeah, you're at a pretty
But
big disadvantage. Like, they do not care about your Tar Creeper. Like, keep it.
yeah, sure, right? You can slam me for one every turn. I don't really care. But when you're playing against aggro, like as you're wont to do on the ladder, especially right now, then that actually gives you a really good advantage.
Yeah. Uh,
So
Wait, do you know if... So you said it was playing Tortolon Shellraiser. Do you know if it was playing N'Zoth?
I don't know. I lost before before we could get that far.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was playing the Tempo Rogue deck at the time. That was one of my few losses I had on my way to
No,
Legend.
I like the out of two.
Yeah, it was a really insane run. I have a screenshot of the list on our Twitter, by the way. Um, it's running both princes, which is really cute.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I like I said, I don't know if Prince 4 is actually correct, but like when he's good, he's good. He does something that no other cards in your deck do.
I mean, I think that, like, for one, if you're looking, like, it's good to have 4 drops. That's
Yes.
a fact for aggressive decks. Second point, Galaka Crawler is going to be gradually more popular over the coming days, making Naga Corsair more of a liability.
Definitely.
Um, and then, like, your other options, like, I feel like Zarel isn't quite what this deck wants to do. You do really want to be impacting the board.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of why the Prince kind of doesn't make sense, because recovering your health isn't impacting the board. Um, but a 4-mana 4/4 taunt is still really sweet, and you do wind up taking a lot of damage early on, like pretty much every game, because of
Yeah.
your hero power.
Right.
Um, and like a lot of the best decks, I think a lot of the harder decks to beat for this deck are things that are like going aggressive and going face, and like a hunter that gets a good start on you, or another rogue that gets a good start on you. I think this is sort of a good way to like give them some trouble. So
Yeah, I agree. And
I think it's a strong pick.
yeah, one secret advantage that it had is like if it's in your hand, you know that you can be more greedy with your weapon. So a lot
Hmm.
of the times when you're playing this deck, because you just don't have very many taunts or like really any way to regain your life, you you have to be careful with your weapon. You can't just be like, well, attack their 5/1, no problem. I mean, you do that often, but you realize that you can't do that infinite times. If you do it 6 times, you lose.
Hmm.
Um, so this allows you to do it, one more time, and this can help you use your hero power to great effect and then mitigate the downside of your hero power and then like buy you more draw steps later. And because of cards like Kelesith and all of your tempo swingy value cards, your draw steps are worth a lot more on average than your opponent's.
Hmm.
I think the biggest weakness of this deck, the price that it pairs, the price rather that it pays for its unfairness is its consistency. It could have some really awkward draws.
Yeah, there's a bunch of like 5-mana derps, and
Yeah,
Shadow Step doesn't really do much in a lot of situations. Other situations, it's unreal how powerful it is. So like
yeah, with
we're
Kelesith,
not taking it out of the deck, or Leroy Jenkins, like the
right?
Vile Spine
Bone Mail.
Slayer. It's an insane card that you definitely
Yeah.
use. It's just if you have a bunch of Bitter Tides and Shadow Steps in your opening hand, you want to kill yourself. You're just not
Yeah.
doing anything.
Yeah, it's really strong. So yeah, I mean this deck is really good. It's unfair, it's aggressive. There are probably ways to hate on it, and we'll see them coming. But we don't know exactly what's next. But right now, this is the premier unfair aggressive deck, and if you're trying to ladder, you should probably be playing it. A lot of people already caught on, so be prepared for the mirror. If you
Hmm.
want to get really cute, just play a tempo rogue list with Eviscerate and Galactic Crawler. You'll probably do pretty okay.
Yeah, I'm sure that would also be great. Maybe throw
Yeah,
some
I bet.
lashers in there.
Yeah, yeah, it'd be
Yeah,
awesome.
Miracle Rogue
Um,
might actually stack up really well.
It could. Yeah, it's typically a little bit weak against aggressive decks, but if you just build it a little bit more aggressive, or a little bit more board centric, with Tark Reaper and Glocker Crawler, you could probably do well. Also, it would be awesome against like Rosaka's Priest.
Yeah, that's also still
So,
pretty popular, I think,
yeah,
because
yeah, for sure.
overall I think it still has one of the better win rates against this rogue deck, or at least amongst the control decks. Like
Yeah,
I still generally feel like I'm at a pretty big advantage when I'm the rogue versus a priest,
right.
but
Yeah, same.
I've lost, and it sounds like you lost at least once to it.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I definitely have. When I played a bit on the Legend ladder, I started losing more to it because a lot of people attacked. But
There you go.
yeah, I mean, it's still a strong deck. So just I guess as a final note, the way that you can use this knowledge of fairness and unfairness to
Mm,
improve your game, you so first of all, when you're brewing, be aware of unfair interactions, things that are unfair that you can put in your deck. One of the simplest and even most like bread and butter unfair packages we see now is just like two pirates and patches,
mhm.
which gives you a really good turn one. If you're playing an aggressive deck, that's something you probably want. Um, so when you're brewing a deck, be aware when it's overly fair. If you find yourself putting a bunch of cards in your deck that are just individually powerful, but don't synergize, and their synergies are weak, um, you might end up just playing a fair deck, and you're going to lose to somebody who's more unfair than you.
Yeah, I feel like something like Dragon Paladin would fall there right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Like
Like,
it's just like all the cards are good. Like you look at it on paper, you're like, yeah, I mean this is good cards. This is a good deck with good cards in it. But then like you're just doing normal stuff while your
yeah,
opponent's steamrolling you with ridiculous strategies and like bone mares on bone mares on bone mares.
right. Yeah, or Shadowstep Bone Mares, SI7 Agents, Bile Spines. You're just like, wow, you killed my 5 mana card that was worth 5 mana. It's just it's not um, it's not a good idea to play fair decks into unfair decks, and there will always be unfair decks on the ladder to check fair decks and keep them sort of
Keep
down.
them out.
Yeah, and the synergy is a lot of the time where the unfairness comes from.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about Pirate Warrior, Aggressive Druid, and Murloc Paladin from Ongoro, all three of those decks like had incidental synergistic interactions, like between the Murloc stuff, incidental upgrade effects, and cheating on mana to get Big Mark of the Lotus.
Yeah, like I mean, I was thinking about it earlier for years. Like Arcanite Reaper? Not a Hearthstone card. Garbage. Nobody uses that. Upgrade? Not a Hearthstone card. I'm gonna Force of Nature Savage Roar, or like, Pyroblast you. I play real cards. And then, and then Blood Cell Cultist and N'Zoth First Mate showed up, and suddenly those were cards. And it's not, the upgrade didn't change. Arcanite Reaper didn't change. It's the synergy. It's the
Right.
combination with these new pirates that suddenly are like, oh my god, he has Arcanite Reaper upgrade. That's 18 damage.
Right.
That was always something you could do. It just wasn't uh, good enough on its own. It needed more buddies to be unfair with, and
Yeah.
that took it to an unfair level. And so there's sort of a pitfall that you can fall into when you're building a deck is trying to make something strong and using a bunch of strong cards, but ultimately the strategy overall or the synergies, the packets of synergy in your deck aren't unfair enough, aren't as unfair as what you're going to play against.
Yeah. Right. Right. Definitely. Um, it's good to be aware of that when you're brewing. You really just want to do the most unfair things you can. That's a good place to start when you're deck building. Instead of just looking at some of the synergies that are there, you have to evaluate actually how good they are.
Yeah, you can
Um,
definitely go both ways. It's just you always need to do the fairness check at one point or another. If you're like, well,
yeah.
I definitely want to, I kind of feel like it would be fun to play Murlocs in Shaman. I can build that deck, and then you sit down and you try and put 30 together. That's fine. It's just before you go play on the ladder, you should look and observe, am I really doing degenerate, unfair things, or am I just playing a fair deck and a bunch of reasonable minions? I have a feeling in this specific scenario it'd probably be the latter.
Right.
Um, but that if you get inspired and you like get like, oh, this combination is going to be sweet, and arrange that, um, really a good way to figure out if it's going to work or not is to look at its unfairness level and how many unfair things it can do.
Definitely. Yeah. Assessing that outright and sort of explicitly is a good place to go. Um, you think that's a good place to wrap up for today?
I'm fairly wrapped.
I'm unfairly
Oh
wrapped.
well, we're a perfect combo then. Perfect compliments.
I agree. It's Hearthstone. So if you want to get an unfair advantage over all your opponents, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/lastturnhs, facebook.com/lastturnhs. As always, we're on iTunes, YouTube, Google Play. You can find us there and find all the content that we produce. We're on a number of other podcasting services, so just look about. You can find us. If we're not on your favorite ones, tweet at us, let us know, and we can look into putting our podcast there.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
feel like Spotify might be a thing that has podcasts.
I'll look
Um,
into that. I recently installed Spotify.
but if anybody does use Spotify and would like us on there, definitely let us know. And I actually think that since we're so forthcoming with all this information, it's giving our listeners a fair advantage, I would say.
I think it's a fair advantage. Yeah, for sure, because we're telling it to everybody, right?
So but I mean, it's gonna feel unfair. It's
Oh
gonna
yeah,
feel that like spicy unfairness.
yeah, definitely. When you play against somebody who's just not having access to that information, what an edge you
Oh
have.
man, they're gonna feel like such a pleb.
Yeah, with that, I think we'll catch you guys next
Yeah,
turn.
thanks so much for listening. See you next turn.